It is a beautiful morning in north central Indiana. I hope it's a beautiful morning wherever you're at. And we're going to kick off our annual ACC meeting. It's a little bit different this year because of COVID. And we're going to make it virtual, and hopefully you have a great experience. A lot of people have done some very hard work to make the experience good. So next slide. So the Indiana ACC mission and goals, as most of you know, we went through a strategic plan that we're in the middle of. And part of that strategic plan was a mission statement and our value statement. The mission is to transform cardiovascular care and improve heart health for all Hoosiers. Our values include, in every decision, the Indiana ACC is patient-centered. We are stronger through teamwork and collaboration. We do strive for professionalism and excellence, and we believe in professional well-being. Next, please. So we need your feedback. So please visit the community section on the platform and take a look at the discussion topic called Indiana ACC. Tell us what you think. And please visit the survey link listed and reply to the brief questions. This was actually part of our strategic plan, and we'd like to get your input on, what you feel about the Indiana ACC and where we need to go. Next, please. This is the planning committee, and the person that's not on this is probably the person that should be on this the most, and that's Gwen Goldfarb. So I lost my slide. Does everybody else see the slides?
No.
No. So Ashley's got to get us right. Okay. So Gwen's did the yeoman's work for the planning this virtual meeting. The other members also did a great job, and that includes, Constance Adams from Gary Maryville, Julie Cleary from IU, Ray Dunsman from Parkview and Fort Wayne, Alex Lee from St. Vincent's in Indianapolis, Ryan Mallory, who's also from IU. I guess, can you go down a little bit, Ashley, as far as, yeah, there's more people on that, including, well, if you're on the list, thank you so very much for helping out, and we do acknowledge everyone that participated. They spent a lot of time and effort to try to put this together. Next slide. For CME, this is an accredited CME activity. What you need to do is go online and complete the CME CNE certificate to claim MOC points, and that will be issued electronically following submission of the evaluation. If you do not receive the email within the 2 weeks of the conference, please contact Melissa Valentine at the ACC, and that's her email address. Next, please. Please tweet and tag at INACC. Dr. Daly wants to make sure that everybody does as much of that as possible so that we can tell people about what's going on and the experience that you're having. Next. And a big special thanks to our sponsors and exhibitors for their support of the meeting. Next. Yeah, and please take time to visit each of our exhibitors. It's important for them to have a participation at their booths. Some of these people went through incredible hoops to get their companies to agree to sponsor this virtual meeting. We're kind of leading the way in this, and the experience that they have, may result in their ability to sponsor events like this in the future. So please, everyone, if you can, visit the exhibitors. Next. Oh yes, the community tab has lots of discussions and virtual meetups, so be sure to visit the community tab. We have a leaderboard, basically for visiting the exhibitors, and also a photo contest. So please check those out as well. And next, oh yes, the ground rules. So we'll be utilizing Whova question and answer and chat box, and use the Q&A for questions about the session. Use the chat box for comments. I hope that's pretty self-explanatory. Before I go into introducing our moderator, I just want to remind everybody that we do have a election for the next governor of the Indiana chapter of the American College of Cardiology. You should have all received an email about that election, so I hope everybody takes a look at that and votes. So with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Vijay Rao. He's the director of the Franciscan Cardio-Oncology Program and director of the Heart Failure Program and Anticoagulation Clinic at Franciscan. So with that, Vijay, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you, Don, and good morning and welcome to all of you from, believe it or not, around the globe. I saw that there were participants from India as well as from Africa. So thank you for tuning in. So as cardiovascular professionals, we've been trained in the latest technologies and techniques and pharmacology through extensive clinical trials. But one area that perhaps hasn't received enough attention is how patients can modify their lifestyle to impact their overall health. So Indiana has one of the highest rates of childhood obesity as well as adult obesity in the United States. And this is a key area if we're going to make an impact in terms of overall cardiovascular health. So diets come and go, but really begs the question as to what type of diet should we be promoting to our patients, both in terms of prevention of cardiovascular events, but also in terms of safety for some of our patients that already have pre-existing cardiovascular disease. So let's get ready to rumble. This is the format today of our debate: paleo versus vegan or plant-based diets for the cardiovascular patient. Each speaker is going to have 12 minutes to make an initial presentation. There'll be 10 minutes, and then there'll be a 10-minute rebuttal period, and then we'll have 16 minutes of Q&A. So with that, let me introduce in our diet vegan corner, we have Dr. Danielle Belardo. We're privileged to have her coming all the way from California. Dr. Belardo initially received her training at Drexel University for medical school, and then followed that with residency training at Temple. Followed that subsequently with cardiovascular fellowship just outside of Philadelphia, and has recently relocated to Newport Beach, California, where she is the director of the cardiology at IOPBM. And she has extensive training in and has been really a worldwide proponent of plant-based diets. Many are familiar with her on Twitter and elsewhere. She's given grand rounds across the world on this topic, sharing her experience with respect to plant-based diet and how that can really impact her CV patients. So we're very proud to have her here. And in the other corner, we have Dr. Ryan Daly, who is representing the paleo diet. Dr. Daly is the medical director of cardiovascular imaging and CT and MRI at Franciscan Health. He hails from Boston, where he had completed his medical training and residency, followed by cardiology fellowship at the Cleveland Clinic, and subsequently did an imaging fellowship at the Brigham and Women's Harvard Medical School. And he also has a personal experience with the paleo diet, which really gives him a unique perspective to be able to educate us on the role for our cardiovascular patients. So with that, again, appreciate your time. I will also just make a quick housekeeping point. Please go to the question and answer section. We have a poll up live right now where you can vote for Team Vegan or vote for Team Paleo. We're going to try to repeat that at the end of the debate and see if we're able to change any minds going forward. And then lastly, you can just add to the question and answer section as we go, and I'll be happy to get to your questions at the end. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Belardo.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rao, for the fantastic introduction, and I really appreciate it. So I'm going to get started, share my screen. 1 second. Okay. Okay. So thank you so much for having me, everyone. This is such an honor for me. I'm so excited to talk about plant-based nutrition, and I'm really excited because I think that plant-based nutrition and paleo have a lot in common. And when it comes to debates, I actually think that paleo, compared to a lot of various other dietary patterns, is a fantastic diet. So I think that me and Ryan will have a lot more in common than everyone might think. So starting with what a whole food plant-based diet is, just in case there's a little confusion. Whole food plant-based diets, I'm going to try to fit this all in 12 minutes, but it's really just minimally, whole food plant-based diets are minimally or smartly processed foods. So fruits, vegetables, legumes such as beans, lentils, peas, tofu, tempeh, whole grains, yams, nuts, seeds, and plant oils that focus on unsaturated fat. But what a whole food plant-based diet is not is, you may recognize this paper from Jack. This was a Satija paper published in 2017. A whole food plant-based diet, we are not advocating for the potato chip and Oreo diet. Just the absence of animal products, we are by no means saying that makes things healthy. Oreos happen to be vegan, but they are not healthy. So this great paper from Jack in 2017 was essentially looked at the Nurses' Health Study, looked at over 200,000 people from Nurses' Health Study, Nurses' Health Study 2, Health Professional Follow-Up Study. They actually had 4.8 million person years of follow-up. And essentially they found that higher adherence to a healthy plant-based diet was independently inversely associated with coronary heart disease. But unhealthy plant-based diet and unhealthful plant-based foods were, and same with animal foods, were positively associated with CHD. So very much advocating for a healthful plant-based diet. And so plant-based diets can help reduce cardiac risk factors like ischemic heart disease, hypertension, cholesterol, obesity, and diabetes. And I'll go through a few of these. So for example, CRP, so there's a randomized controlled trial. They looked at individuals with stable CAD and randomized them to plant-based diet versus AHA diet and found that a plant-based diet dropped inflammation and CRP significantly more. LDL cholesterol, we have numerous trials showing that plant-based diets can help reduce LDL cholesterol. I'll get more into detail on that. And then, of course, blood pressure as well. We have numerous trials additionally that show plant-based diets, such as the Cardia trial and Epic Oxford trials, that show that plant-based diets can help reduce blood pressure. So multiple risk factors for CAD. So the Epic Oxford cohort study, as I just mentioned, this was, of course, a large cohort study. They eventually found that vegetarians and vegans had significantly lower all-cause mortality than regular meat eaters, and although there was no overall heterogeneity of risk between the diet groups. So if you actually do a test for heterogeneity between groups, because of the stepwise difference between the groups were too close to meet statistical significance in this study, but relative to the regular meat eaters, they were actually statistically significantly improved. And then you have another cohort study, so the vegetarian dietary patterns. This is in the Adventist Health Study. They looked at 73,000 Seventh-day Adventist men and women that were recruited. They assessed diet at baseline with food frequency questionnaires, categorized them into various 5 different dietary patterns, and they found vegetarian diets with the lowest all-cause mortality and some reductions in cause-specific mortality. Specifically for Adventist Health Study, was more robust in males. Diabetes and plant-based diet as well. We have numerous studies that have shown us the NHANES data, Rotterdam study, of course, Seventh-day Adventists, that have shown us that diabetes can also improve on a plant-based diet. So since I had to squeeze this in 12 minutes, I really want to get to, well, what does a paleo diet have that a plant-based diet does not? Let's start with saturated fat. So a paleo diet includes animal products, and so saturated fat is an important part of cardiovascular disease. And if we look at this study, this is a meta-analysis of 395 published metabolic ward experiments, the effect of various dietary lipids on blood cholesterol. And it clearly demonstrated how saturated fat directly increases LDL-C. And this was isocaloric increases in saturated fat intake. And so isocaloric increases in SFA, they were found to be associated with increase in total and LDL cholesterol. And in general, when this compared to polyunsaturated, monounsaturated fat. Polyunsaturated fat actually decreased total and low density LDL cholesterol as well. And these are all univariate models. So the saturated fat, we were all replacing SFA with either MUFA, PUFA, or carbohydrates. So you may ask, well, what's the effect of saturated fat then? And so then you want to look at, we have, well, Mensick did a great study, did a regression analysis. And we found the purpose of this study was to account for the differences in the ward trials that we just looked at. So the issue is the SFA is replacing other things, right? So you're replacing SFA with MUFA, PUFA, or carbohydrates. So the question then is, well, what is the effect of SFA alone of increasing LDL-C versus how much of that is because of what you're replacing it with? So the purpose of this meta-regression analysis was to have equations essentially to control for those factors and then give you that predicted and observed LDL-C based on saturated fat intake and taking into account for all those things into the equation. So these are the Mensick equations. And essentially, if you look at these dots, each one represents a trial, and they were low-end trials, some of them down to 10 individuals. That's how much little variability there was here. And so using this, they found that replacing saturated fat with regardless of what you're replacing it with, and mostly the highest effects we see are for PUFAs, but this generates a predicted LDL cholesterol change when you are replacing SFA. So your observed LDL cholesterol is what you actually observe, and the observed variability is actually due in different trials. You're replacing separate things, and the Mensick equations took all of this into account. So the more saturated fat you eat, the higher your LDL. And of course, this is an ACC conference, so I'm going to assume that everyone here appreciates the importance of how high LDL it causes atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. But just in case anyone here forgot, the European Atherosclerosis Society Consensus Panel, great detail in the consensus statement that we have consistent evidence from numerous and multiple different types of trials that it's clinical and genetic studies that unequivocally establish that LDL-C, high LDL-C causes atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. And this is looking at prospective epidemiological cohort studies, Mendelian randomization studies, randomized trials of LDL lowering therapies, meta-analysis, multiple studies. And so the consistent finding is pretty clear. And then of course we have our recent Cochrane review showing us that reduction in saturated fat intake. This showed us that reducing saturated fat intake for at least 2 years causes a potentially important reduction in combined cardiovascular events, and replacing the energy from saturated fat with polyunsaturated or carbohydrates appear to be useful strategies, while MUFAs are a little more unclear. And so this was an important study to just confirm what we know about saturated fat being important in LDL-C. All right, well, you may say, then what about lean meat? So let's talk about then chicken or any other lean sorts of meats, game meats, or anything else. Well, this study done by Ron Krauss is a fantastic study. It was a well-designed trial. It was actually a randomized controlled trial, crossover trial. He took generally healthy men and women, randomly assigned them to 1 or 2 parallel arms of high or low SFA, and then within each, he actually allocated them to red meat, white meat, or non-meat protein diets, consumed for 4 weeks in random order, and looked at the primary outcomes like LDL, ApoB, small, medium LDL particles, etc. He found that LDL cholesterol and ApoB were higher with both the red and white meat consumption than non-meat, independent of SFA content, and primary outcomes actually didn't differ between red or white meat. So as you guessed it, the best for LDL-C and ApoB was the plant-based non-meat low SFA arm. And you could actually argue and say, well, hey, dietary cholesterol wasn't controlled in this trial. It wasn't the same, but that's the point, right? Because the only way to get dietary cholesterol down is to eliminate animal products completely. And all plants have 0 cholesterol. And then we can even say, okay, well, let's talk about interventional studies. So let's say the Lyon Diet Heart Study, for example, and if you actually look at the intake of foodstuffs, so Lyon Heart Diet Study was impressive outcomes. After 40 months, they found that it was essentially actually stopped early because of the significant benefit effects from the cohort. They found 70% lower risk of recurrent heart disease, cardiac death, non-fatal heart attacks. And if you look at what the interventional study actually did, they actually increased legumes, which generally in some Paleolithic diets they recommend against. They actually increased bread and fruit and vegetable consumption. They reduced meat, butter, cream, and actually increased a vegetable-based margarine that was rich in PUFAs. So Leonhardt study is a study with hard outcomes that shows us that making changes that are more plant-based, including higher legumes, higher bread, wheat, higher fruits, vegetables, lower meat, lower animal products, lower butter and cream, actually improved hard outcomes. So then legume consumption. So most paleo diets, I'm not sure, there's a variety of them, so I'm not sure which one Dr. Daly is going to present, but it's a lot of paleo diets recommend against legume consumption. And we actually have multiple systematic reviews and meta-analysis that show us that legume consumption has been associated with longevity. So this one was a great study that showed 14 studies that were conducted on 11 cohorts. They looked at 367,000 individuals. And they essentially found that legume consumption was associated with lower risk of cardiovascular disease in these studies as well. So to wrap it up, eat more plants. But I do want to state for the record that paleo diet, I think, is still a fantastic option, and it can be, it's so much better than the standard American diet. So that's my spiel. Thank you.
Great presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Belardo. And now we'll have 12 minutes for Dr. Daly.
Okay, here we go, huh? All right. I had to do that. All right. Thanks for having me today. Next slide. All right, we're going to talk about paleo diet versus vegan diet for cardiovascular health today. Next slide. Okay, so what is a Paleolithic diet? Well, it's really not just one diet. In fact, we evolved to be omnivores, and because of different places that we lived, we had different food choices and different macros. If you look on the slide to the right, some tribes and some hunter-gatherer tribes had 90% animal protein, such as the Aboriginal Eskimos, and some, such as the Hazara, had 20%. So we had different diets going back over 2 million years. Next slide, please. So what type of foods did they eat? Well, they ate different types of animal protein, insects, fish, shellfish, plant leaves, seaweeds, a lot of plants, roots, tubers, berries, nuts and seeds, and honey. What it didn't include is it didn't include things like dairy, refined grains, that would be sugars, cereal grains, breads, legumes, although I really don't have a problem with legumes, and a lot of people who are pro-paleo don't either. Isolated sugars, such as plant sugar, cane sugar, alcohol, and refined salt. Next slide. Now, one of the things that I think that is very important to note here is that the animals and the plants that we eat today are markedly different than what our ancestors ate. In fact, domesticated animals actually have much more fat, 20 to 30% fat versus 3.9% fat for free-living African herbivores. So they were much higher in leaner protein, which does matter. They had less fat, fewer calories, more protein per unit weight of energy. In fact, even the fat composition itself was actually different in wild animals and included something called eicosapentaenoic acid, and we don't have that in modern beef. So when we talk about a Paleolithic diet, we're not necessarily talking about rye and Wagyu beef and bacon. Okay, next slide. Paleo diets are nutritionally dense, as you can see on the left column versus the right, very high in vitamins, iron, which a lot of vegetarians and vegans have problems with, very high in calcium, despite the lack of dairy, again, an area that vegans and vegetarians have problems with. And I want you to also notice that it was actually pretty high in fiber as well, which our modern diet is not. Next slide. The animal proteins are actually very, very nutritionally dense. Now, I disagree with actually the ranking of this. This doesn't take into consideration of antioxidants and phytochemicals and some of the benefits of plants. Most pro-paleo physicians and proponents are actually not anti-plant. They just don't think that animal protein itself is as bad as some of our vegan friends would lead us to believe. Next slide. So should we listen to experts? Well, this is from the American College of Cardiology Preventive Task Force. And cardiovascular mortality include sugar, low carb, high carb, sweeteners, refined sugar, refined grains, trans fats, saturated fats, red meats, processed meats. All the things that I've struck out are actually not paleo. In fact, as you'll notice, that paleo diets are actually, historically, were actually pretty high in fiber, pretty high in plant-based carbohydrates, and very similar to modern Mediterranean diets. And in fact, the AHA recommended diet of the Mediterranean-like diet includes vegetables, fruits, nuts, and lean vegetable or animal protein, preferably fish and vegetable fiber. And that will be important as we go forward. And these have actually shown to decrease the risk of all-cause mortality compared to control or standard diets. Next slide. So the vegan diet, which we're not really comparing paleo to strict vegetarian, can include the following. I'm just saying what it can, not what Dr. Belardo or most physicians would recommend. Number one, it doesn't include any animal proteins. So therefore, you're actually deficient in B12 without supplementation, and that will be important later. Number two, it may include seed oils, which includes soybean oils, corn oils, rapeseed oils, things like this, again, which can be okay, especially if you find them in plant-based materials, fruit juice, gluten or wheat, which some people have problems with, may be permitted, and refined carbohydrates are okay in a vegan diet, but not in a well-formulated plant-based diet that, of course, Dr. Belardo would recommend to our patients. Next slide. Okay, the Mediterranean diet has been linked to lower mortality from cardiovascular disease and all causes, and does incorporate a moderate amount of fish, lean meats, and poultry. Next slide. The dark side. So these are things that could be included in a vegan diet, but are not part of a healthy plant-based or formulated diet. So I'm saying that compared to these things, this part of an unhealthy plant-based diet, is red meat or animal protein really that bad? Next slide. The evidence. Next slide. So this is the long list that we have of randomized trials comparing a Paleolithic diet to a plant-based or vegan diet. There isn't any. Okay, so I think we missed one slide. Can you go back to? Okay, forward, sorry about that. All right, so we're gonna talk about, we actually did try going from animal protein to plant-based protein when we went from the hunter-gatherer phase of our evolution to the agricultural phase, and where we really markedly increased our consumption, which means decreased our consumption of animal protein, and guess what happened? We lost about 5 inches. We had more dental caries, more anemia, and more degenerative spine conditions. So this is historical evidence, and this did coincide with refined grains. Again, this would be breads and cereals and things like this. Height is actually considered a proxy for overall population health. And because it's at a population level, that's why people believe that this coincided with true health of the population as we moved from a hunter-gatherer to agricultural. Next slide, please. So contemporary hunter-gatherers have lower blood pressure, improved insulin sensitivity, lower BMI, greater VO2 max, and stronger bones and better visions. This is from reports in clinical cardiology. Next slide. So the Catawbans are horticulturists. They're one of the last populations that has a diet similar to a Paleolithic-like diet. They eat roots, yams, sweet potatoes. Again, we're very pro-plants in the paleo community, but they do eat things such as fish and coconut. Next slide, please. So Dr. Lindbergh actually went there and he interviewed a whole bunch of them. And what he found is that they actually didn't know the signs and symptoms of stroke and heart attack. And he did a bunch of EKGs. And on the whole, they actually didn't find any evidence of ischemic heart disease or atherosclerotic stroke in this population. Now, this wasn't an autopsy study. This was basically based upon interviews and some ECGs, and there are a lot of systems of this trial. Next slide. Calcium. Okay, next slide. So I think that this is probably the strongest evidence that I have on my debate here. Let's talk about the Semaine. Well, they did a cross-sectional cohort study of a indigenous South American tribe called the Semaine. Next slide. And what they showed here is that they did calcium scores in 705 individuals who followed this hunter-gatherer-like lifestyle, and they found that they had exceedingly low calcium scores. In fact, some of the healthiest hearts in the world. And what you'll notice there is, look at the mean HDL and mean LDL, exceedingly low. And there was very low obesity, very low hypertension. There was no cigarette smoking. Now, the CRP was elevated, but there was also a lot of infection. So basically, the interpretation was that in a hunter-gatherer population, they have very few coronary artery disease risk factors and have the lowest level of coronary artery disease of any population recorded to date. Okay, so and these people had very low LDL, so eating a Paleolithic-like diet does not necessarily mean high DL. It does not necessarily mean high saturated fat. They had low blood pressure, low glucose, and they had plenty of physical activity. Next slide. They actually ate a pretty low-fat diet. 14% of their diet was saturated fat. It was high in carbohydrates, low in simple sugars, no trans fats, preservatives, etc. And they were very, very physically active. Next slide. 17% of their diet came from lean proteins such as wild pig, tapir, and caper. It's a large rodent. 7% from fish, and the rest came from eating roots like sweet potato and plantains, and it was topped with foraged fruits and nuts. Next slide. Their blood pressure was outstanding. I wish I had converted this to the American system, but again, if you can go back and look at this, their lipid profile is truly outstanding. And I think that we'd be happy if any of our patients had blood pressures and heart rates that look like this. And this is done by age strata. Next slide. Okay, so based upon their calcium scores and biomarkers, the arterial age of the Semaine was 28 years younger than matched industrial populations. Next slide. So I thought that Danielle was going to talk about TMAO. TMAO will saying that this is disease we eat animals. TMAO is formed after you eat foods containing a substance called choline, but this nutrient is found also in eggs, fish, and poultry. And as the bacteria in your gut feeds on the choline, they make a substance called trimethylamine, which your liver then oxidizes and converts to TMAO, which has been implicated in or correlated with atherosclerosis. Next slide. So beware of this. Correlation is not causation. We really need to further studies to basically demonstrate the pathogenesis of atherosclerosis relative to this biomarker. Very inconsistent data regarding TMAO. And the levels are primarily determined by the diet, gut flora, as well as liver enzymes called FMAO, as well as your relative kidney function. Next slide. So in fact, what they found is that when people actually increased dietary choline, they actually did not find increased risk. In fact, fish consumption, seen in the Physician's Health Study, was inversely associated with fatal coronary heart disease. The National Institutes of Health actually says that certain vegetables and beans are a rich source of choline, with grains, nuts, and seeds being reliable sources in general. In fact, soybeans have more choline, again, associated with TMAO than beef and chicken, and most beans have more than dairy product or even tuna. Slide. As you can see, this slide shows that different sources of choline, which may be implicated in raising levels of TMAO, salmon, chicken, tuna, but also look at Brussels sprouts, broccoli, and almonds, not insignificant. Next slide. In fact, TMAO is raised 53 times more eating halibut and cod than it does with eating beef or eggs. So if you buy the TMAO argument, which Danielle did not put forth, then you'd have to believe that cod and haddock were more atherogenic than beef or eggs. Next slide.
Dr. Daly, we're going to need to wrap up here and get to some of these comments in the rebuttal.
Yep. Okay, next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. So do vegetarians really live longer? I want you to introduce the concept of user bias. Basically, when people who are vegetarians tend to exercise more, not smoke, and do healthy things. So when they actually recruited men and women from a health food store and they followed them up, they actually Next slide, please. In fact, vegetarians and vegans may actually have a higher stroke risk, and in this British Medical Journal study, they showed that compared to meat eaters, they actually had a 20% higher risk of stroke, potentially linked to lower B12 levels, but more studies were needed to investigate that. Next slide. So in closing, veganism does not meet our essential nutritional needs without supplementation. It has more in common with paleo diet than the standard American diet, and veganism and vegetarianism has not been proven to reduce all-cause mortality, ischemic heart disease in a health-conscious population, accounting for healthy user bias. Next slide. Observational studies showing that vegans are healthier or plagued with healthy user bias. And in general, a lot of these studies are plagued by confounding due to retrospective analysis retrospective analysis. So I think that's basically about it. I think I'm over my time. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Daly. Well, let's so two very interesting perspectives. Let's move back to Dr. Belardo for about 10 minutes on a rebuttal to what you've seen presented by Dr. Daly. Thank you.
Okie dokie. Let me just pull up my screen. Let's see. Let's see. Okay. There we go. Slideshow. Okay, so I totally agree with Dr. Daly that I do not recommend, as I mentioned before, a vegan. A vegan is a kind of a catch-all term. It's more of a lifestyle choice, whereas plant-based diet, this study which I mentioned, I recommend a plant-based diet that focuses on, whole foods, whole plant foods as much as possible, minimally processed, low in saturated fat, low in zero refined grains. And this great study from Nurses Health Study shows us with 3.5 million years of follow-up that the more closely individuals follow eating a healthful plant-based diet was inversely associated with coronary heart disease versus an unhealthy plant-based diet or also eating more animal foods. I just want to touch in, I just added 2 slides in real quick just to touch in on vitamin B12 status. So actually, ironically, people cite all the time that B12 is actually lower in vegans, but it's been studied quite a lot. And there's actually, even in this one study, they even found, this is one that's cited frequently, that 92% of vegans are deficient in B12. Actually, in this major unsaid issues, actually in this study, no vegans were actually taking a B12 supplement, and we actually recommend not only all vegans supplement with B12, but also actually the majority of the population now should be supplementing B12. But additionally, there was actually no statistically significant difference across the board for MMA, which is really the only thing that matters. And with regards to zinc deficiency, that's something that's also claimed often too. And this is from the Srikumar paper, showed that shifting to a vegetarian diet does not make one susceptible to being deficient in zinc levels. There's multiple other papers that cover this. It's like one of those very much a bit of a common belief that's been studied quite a lot. There was a paper by Retton as well, where they looked at 3 groups of healthy subjects, 68 people that were eating, supplementing with bran. They found that they didn't have any issues with zinc deficiency either. So it's really just if you eat a well-formulated, well-planned plant-based diet, which is advocated for by the American Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, it's got to be a well-formulated, well-planned diet. I agree with Dr. Daly completely that a poorly planned plant-based or vegan diet that's filled with vegan junk food, just abstaining from animal products alone is not something that is going to make someone healthy. And we reiterate that all the time, which is why paleo and vegan, a healthy plant-based diet truly do have a lot in common. And they're both, if our entire population was on a paleo and a whole food plant-based diet, we'd have a lot less disease if they were on either. But the one thing I do want to point out with regards to hard outcomes, so it's really hard for someone who's going to say paleo is superior to a whole food plant-based diet to explain away then the Leon Diet Heart Study with hard outcomes. Then why does, we have statistically significant increases in bread consumption, legume consumption, fruits, vegetables, drastically lower meat consumption, lower butter and cream consumption, and it resulted in significant reduction in hard outcomes for cardiac events. And with regards to a paleo diet being 14% SFA, that's quite much higher than the ACC recommendation, given that we have in this, in all of our studies here, showing that when you have any amount of saturated fat you eat is actually quite predictable in a linear relationship to your LDL-C. So for our patients, now that we are with so many trials demonstrating that we want to get our patients LDL-C as low as possible, knowing that there really is no benefit to eating meat, for example, with regards to, I'm not a plant-based person that thinks that any small dose of animal products is going to make a difference. That's why I didn't bring up TMAO either. But I will say that keeping SFA low is beneficial in our cardiovascular patients with regards to reducing cardiovascular risk. And, even if you mentioned, well, about lean meat, I mean, Ron Krauss did this study, and it was a beautifully done randomized controlled trial with a washout crossover study, and found that whether it was white meat or red meat, it raised your LDL-C and your ApoB and your non-HDL cholesterol. And this was as compared to, of course, the plant-based protein, which didn't probably relate to the dietary cholesterol. So I think that the benefits of a paleo diet, there are so many. It's very plant-friendly. They recommend against eating things like butter, cream, and cheese, but I don't quite think that there's a way to say it's superior, but I do think that it's much superior to the standard American diet for sure. And I think that a paleo diet is, I guess I'm not making much of a great debate here against it, because I think it's healthier than what a lot of our patients are eating as it is. But I will say that the data I don't think can robustly show that eating red meat or animal meat is beneficial. In a time where everyone should be supplementing B12, we have data to show that zinc deficiency, iron deficiency, and B12 deficiency isn't an issue in plant-based individuals who follow a well-formulated, well-planned plant-based diet. I don't think advocating for red meat is for health benefits, or meat in general, even lean meat, is needed, is necessary for a healthful diet. I didn't even bring up PrediMed because I wasn't going to, but if you look at the pro-vegetarian sub-pattern of PrediMed in the post-hoc analysis, even that found that the only ones that had cardiovascular mortality reduction was in the pro-vegetarian sub-pattern, so the people who are actually eating no meat in that pattern as well. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it.
Thank you, Dr. Belardo, for that rebuttal. Dr. Daly, we've got about 5 to 6 minutes on your end for rebuttal before we're getting a ton of great questions for both of you. So I want to make sure we have enough time to get to those. So you got about 5 minutes for your rebuttal.
All right, I'm going to try to make this as concise as possible. So basically, we tried plants. We started off eating animals, and we lost about 5 inches. So we grew shorter as we increased our animal, as we decreased our animal protein. A lot of the clinical trials that are comparing animal protein to plant-based diets are retrospective, and not long-term randomized clinical control trials with long-term follow-up. They're just not. And because of that, they are rife with confounding. And the confounding is recall bias, and again, that healthy user bias, which is pretty significant. And again, when you looked at patients that were recruited from a health food store and followed longitudinally, you didn't see any difference in outcomes. Now, Dr. Belardo shows that biomarkers improved. Yet I've shown you a population down in South America that follows a hunter-gatherer-like diet, has outstanding biomarkers, and has no calcium. Not no calcium, but trivial calcium. Truly exceptional, the most predictive biomarker that there is for cardiovascular events, coronary artery calcium, was exceedingly low in this hunter-gatherer population. So we really have to take a look at this. Now, when Dr. Belardo starts talking about eating red meat, well, let's be careful, because this diet was really paleo diet versus a vegan diet. And what I'm saying is that you're going to have a very hard time convincing me that eating fish is bad. You're going to have a very hard time convincing me that eating eggs are bad, and it's much better for you to supplement with B12 when you can get these things from actually eating fish and eggs. Now, if you want to start talking about red meat, again, it's a little bit more challenging, and the data is not robust regarding red meat. Again, when you take into consideration confounding from these trials, we don't have anything perspective. We evolved eating red meat. We evolved eating bison. We evolved eating game. Eating deer, caribou, and bison is completely different than eating Wagyu beef. In fact, I showed this in terms of the fat content of African wild game. It's different. So not all red meat is the same. I think that basically there's a lot of dogma and bias in this space. I think that before we completely cut out an entire food group or entire macronutrient that we evolved eating, that perhaps we should have very, very high quality data, which I'm not convinced that we have. Now, teasing out red meat, how are you going to tease out that they're eating ribeye? You know, you're not seeing a lot of people just eating caribou. You're not seeing a lot of people just eating sardines or fish or things like this. The closest thing that we have to this was the data from the Semaine, again, which were eating fish, lean animal proteins, and again, exceedingly high, exceedingly low calcium scores and low cardiovascular risk, which we know is the most predictive biomarker we have. I think that Dr. Belardo has to explain away the British Medical Journal article that showed that patients that do follow a strict vegetarian diet do have problems with increased risk for stroke. And because of that, and it, again, even Dr. Greger was saying that we have to be careful that they supplement with B12. People don't have B12 problems if they actually eat animal protein, high quality animal protein. So not only animal protein is created the same, if you have wild game and you have fish, which people are going to have a very hard time convincing me is bad for you from a cardiovascular perspective, especially since we evolved eating it. It's not necessarily the hamburger that kills you. The hamburger came with some French fries, a Frosty, some buns, and a lot of other crap. So let's be very careful when we start saying that all animal protein is bad. When I'm not sure that we have that. We have a lot of anthropological data that suggests that a very low burden of what we call industrial or Western disease in the hunter-gatherer populations. There's a lot of a difference between what they did and what we do. So don't think that you're going paleo by eating ribeyes every day. Don't think that you're going paleo by eating bacon. That's not what they did. I'm a very big advocate of plants and animals, nuts and berries. And I don't think that anybody's going to show superiority. And I don't think that that is the goal here. I think that both sides are going to show superiority to standard Western diet, which is just awful. And I think that what you're going to show is equanimous. You're going to basically show that there's no difference between a well-formulated Paleolithic-like diet and a well-formulated plant-based diet. It's really the added fats, the added sugars, the seed oils, the processed foods, the fried foods, where they're getting all these excess calories, and where they're getting different things. Because even in a vegetarian or vegan diet, you can have a lot of coconut oil. So this whole argument about LDL, the thing that raises LDL the most, is coconut oil. So what I'm saying is it depends upon your macros and how much, where you're getting, you can't say that all red meat is bad because it raises saturated fat. Well, if you eat a diet that has too much coconut in it, again, you could raise your LDL over there. So we have to be careful with this.
Daly, we're going to have to cut it there. That's
okay.
A nice rebuttal. I think, Dr. Belardo, I could see you raising your hand there. You wanted to comment on that last point. Maybe you can make a comment, and then you have to unmute there, and then we'll move to we have a ton of great questions, so I want to make sure we get time for some of those questions. But why don't you respond to that last comment?
Clarify, a well-planned plant-based diet is not, we do not recommend coconut oil. We recommend low saturated fat, like consistent with ACC's 2019 primary prevention guidelines. So definitely not a coconut oil. And the amount, the red meat and the animal protein study, Ron Krause's study, it looked at its effect in an isocaloric manner against plant proteins for LDL. So yes, of course, one small dose won't make a difference, but we do have robust data at this point in feeding matched control trials to show the effect of animal proteins on lipids like ApoB.
Okay, so let's.
So one last. So she gets 2 minutes, so I get 2 seconds. Okay. All right. So despite the changes in biomarkers, you don't have anything that actually shows hard outcomes with accounting for the healthy user bias. It just doesn't exist.
Study, the experimental group had more smokers, and when they decreased their meat intake, they had hard outcomes for reduced cardiovascular events in a randomized control trial where the experimental group had a higher amount of smokers. And they reduced meat consumption and increased plant, bread, and legume consumption and had reduced cardiovascular mortality.
Okay, the gloves are off, and I'm really enjoying this. This is great. So let's get to some of the questions. People are firing off lots of questions, as I suspected we would get. So let's just start with the fact that there's a lot of confounding in dietary studies. And so this is a question for both of you, maybe first starting with Dr. Belardo. From the Leon Heart study, there was some dietitian counseling for those patients. So they found that there was a lot less alcohol and tobacco use in that population. And so were the effects seen in Leon study really due to the diet, or could it also just be effects on overall health? So that's the first question for you.
Leonhardt that said that found that the experiment group had a slightly higher smoking rate. So maybe with alcohol, but I believe that I believe that they found in the experimental group there was a smaller, slightly higher amount of smoking. But yeah, of course, we recommend. I mean, every cardiologist recommends all lifestyle changes overall, and dietary research in general is incredibly challenging. So I think that's why it's looking at various levels of evidence, from feeding matched metabolic ward studies, control trials that they've done multiple for lipids, all the way up to prospective cohorts, and then randomized control trials, and then epidemiological data.
And Dr. Daly, for you, from the Sunaim, I can't pronounce that properly, but yeah, in that population, there was also a question about confounding with respect to, you mentioned very low levels of LDL and no events, but there also, the exercise in that population is quite significant. So how can you explain the confounding potentially with exercise in that population?
Sure, the same way that you could explain the confounding in terms of any healthy user bias. So it's going to be very hard, basically in a population that is physically fit. So you can that's what I can say about that. You're not going to be able to tease that out anywhere, nor did any of the other trials control for physical activity comparing animal eaters to plant eaters. So you're going to have that anywhere in the literature. So all I can say is that when you have a population that follows a hunter-gatherer like diet, they had outstanding hearts. They didn't have any calcium. Now they were very physically active, and that does help. There's no doubt. But they're not dropping dead of heart attacks. You got to show me the bodies. We can't. I think that's the most important thing if we're going to start to exclude an entire macronutrient group or food group that we evolved eating.
Okay, great. Dr. Belardo, this question's for you. Fructose and glucose can have effects on lipoproteins and uric acid. So the question to you is, if I limit meat, should I also limit fructose?
No, so fructose in forms of fruits and vegetables and whole grains is not, especially in fruit, is not dangerous by any means. I don't think we have any data to show harm from whole fruit consumption. I always go with, ACC primary prevention guidelines that recommend against juices of fruits, anything that's removing, extracting the fiber. But fruit is filled with fiber and so many phytonutrients that it's incredibly beneficial. Eating the whole fruit, of course, not eating, juices and dry fruits and things like that.
Okay, great. Dr. Daly, for you, can you explain the significance of the calorie for calorie reduction from a paleo diet that affects triglycerides and improves and increases HDL, and that's seen with paleo versus a low-fat diet? Do you think there's any significance there?
Can you repeat the question? I want to make sure I get
the significance on triglycerides and HDL with a paleo diet versus a low-fat diet. How does that impact the overall?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think you're going to see that in both, right? So basically, Paleolithic-like diet is going to be a low glycemic index diet. It does have a lot of fiber. It has a lot of plants in it. So you're going to have improved insulin sensitivity. Triglycerides to HDL ratio is basically a marker of insulin sensitivity. And it's a very, very very powerful predictor of cardiovascular outcomes. And you're going to see that also in well-balanced plant-based diets, that you're going to see that triglycerides going to go down. You're going to see the HDL go up. So it's not necessarily the paleo-like diet. It is a non-standard American diet or non-crap diet that you're going to see that in. Yeah. But the diet that Dr. Belardo is advocating is bad. I think it's outstanding. I just don't think that she can convince me that eating fish and eggs and doing a pesco over vegetarian, which would be non-vegan, is bad. I just don't think that you're going to be able to do that. I don't think the data supports that. I think that the red meat area is a little bit contentious, but that's kind of where we are. And I don't think she's trying to do that either.
I agree with you. Fish, I don't think I'll ever argue. I don't think we have any data to show fatty fish is harmful. I'd be quite the opposite. So.
All right, so a lot of questions about intermittent fasting, which is gaining a lot of popularity. So can you both comment, maybe Dr. Belardo first, about how you would or wouldn't advocate for that with the plant-based diet, and then Dr. Daly with the paleo diet?
I actually think Dr. Daly is much more into and knowledgeable about fasting than me, so I'm going to let him take over that. He's like very, very knowledgeable in that space.
Okay, fair enough. Dr. Daly, comments about intermittent fasting?
Yeah, we've been doing it for millennia. Our bodies are designed to not be able to eat for times. We're not, some people will advocate for multiple small meals, and that's really not what our Paleolithic ancestors actually did. And intermittent fasting is a very valid way to wait. And listen, people have to be supervised. Again, I'm not doing medical advice here, despite this being a scientific conference, just in case there's patients out there. Because some people are on insulin, some people are on hypoglycemic agents, and fasting when you're on these medicines could be dangerous. So it has to be done in a supervised setting. Sometimes you want to start to wean down to what we call timed restricted eating, which is creating an eating window. And you can start to work your way up. There's a lot of tricks to the trade. There's some great books on this. But fasting is a really wonderful way to clear your mind, to lose some weight, and has been shown to be safe and effective. Again, should be supervised in the uninitiated, and you can start to work your way into it. I actually do think it's a good part of the diet. And to tell you the truth, they think that might actually have been one of the reasons that they saw some outcomes in the Predi-Med study, because there were a lot of Catholics that were doing fasting on Good Friday. And when this was actually studied, when they did the study, it was during the Lenten season. And they do think that might have been a confounder in those outcomes. So just a thought.
Great. And we're kind of closing in on time here. So one of the last questions for both of you is, I think as much as one of the most important questions is, how do you talk to your patients about diets? How do you sell your diet to your patients in a shortened office visit? And then to kind of follow up on what Dr. Daly was saying, at what point do you refer to a nutritionist? And how do you monitor for compliance in your patients? And we'll finish with that question for each of you. Dr. Belardo.
That's a great question. I think that it's for sure meeting your patients where they're at. I never am trying to get my patients to go 100% plant-based by any means. I think it's just asking them to make small incremental changes. If a patient of mine made a change to a paleo diet, that would be fantastic. It's a much big step up from the standard American diet. And so I think every incremental step in eating more plants, more whole foods is a huge benefit. Obviously for patients, it's just small changes that some patients want to change overnight, but I think in just helping your patients just to make small changes is important. And referring to a registered dietitian, I feel like it's never too early. Insurance is a barrier for some patients, but now with teledietetics, people can really get nutrition counseling covered by various insurance companies through Nutrimity. So I recommend patients start working with a registered dietitian if they can afford to right away.
And then follow up in terms of compliance with the diet. What do you do in your practice?
Yeah, so I do dietary intake, like questionnaires for my patients when they're waiting in the office. So just essentially asking them what a 24-hour meal recall was, and then we have 5 registered dietitians at my private practice now, so we're very RD heavy practice. So a lot of the compliance comes down with the dietitians. But when I was in fellowship and I was in a practice without that many RDs, without any, I would just be kind of just checking with my patients. They would bring my really my patients that were really compliant would use my MyFitnessPal or chronometer, things like that, to track while they're transitioning their diet planning, and they would bring their apps with them. But I can't recommend enough referring your patients to eatright.org, which is the American Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, so they can find an RD to help them transition their diet and work with them. Because it's really hard for physicians to do it spend the time an RD does.
All right, great. Thank you so much. Dr. Daly, last words?
Sure. So basically, I tell my patients that we have to start with eliminating crap from our diet. So get rid of the sugar, get rid of the flour, get rid of the added fats, the added sugars, the fried foods, plants, animals, nuts, and berries. Plants more than animals, lean protein over fat protein, and basically start exercising. The secret to good cardiovascular health is getting rid of processed food. As Dr. Belardo would say, that the diet that I'm advocating for in this debate specifically, and Dr. Belardo's together then do the standard American diet. It really is about getting rid of a lot of the crap. And as far as follow-up goes, basically, again, I do food recall. I ask them how their diet's going, ask them what they had for breakfast, ask them what they ate yesterday, and I ask them if they have any difficulties. And there's different ways to skin this cat, and there's no perfect diet. And we just basically have to meet our patients halfway and do shared decision-making and find out what their goals are, because food choices are very, very personal.
Terrific. Thank you both so much. This was a terrific.
Thanks, Dr. Belardo. You're a great sport. It was, I got to tell you, I was very, very nervous, and hopefully I put up a good fight. It was a very, very worthy and challenging opponent. So it's much appreciated for you taking the time to come at 4:30 in the morning to debate us.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
All right, so we're at time for our break. Thank you all for joining us. That was a really terrific debate. And so I would recommend that you visit our exhibitors at this point, head over to the community tab to find up a meetup of interest to you. Dr. Daly will be leading a group on how to leverage social media. Dr. Ed Fry is going to be there to meet you to talk about what ACC can do for you. Visit the e-poster showcase. You can find the link on the e-poster tab. And then at 9:45 a.m., come back to the agenda page and join the 9:45 a.m. session where we'll be moving into the second debate. So thanks again for your time, and look forward to talking with you on the community chats.